Well, I think that this is all going to destroy the Trump presidency. I mean, he may remain in office all the way to the end of his term, but he's damaged goods in a truly serious way. But you want to think about sort of where we stand on the world stage today. Before this war started on February 28th, the Trump administration had already done enormous damage to America's position in the world, in large part because the president, who is the ultimate unilateralist, was wrecking international institutions, paying no attention to the rules that underpin those institutions. He was disregarding and disrespecting international law, and he was treating allies with unmitigated contempt, especially the Europeans. He was talking about invading Greenland. He was talking about making Canada the 51st state. And if you went to East Asia, the Japanese and the South Koreans, this is before February 28th, had real doubts about relying on the United States for security. And of course, in the course of 2025, he had seriously damaged what had been good relations with India. U.S.-India relations went south during 2025. So the United States, before February 28th, was in real trouble in terms of its foreign policy. And what's happened since February 28th has just damaged us further. If you look at U.S.-European relations, you think about all the damage that was done over the Ukraine war, then all the damage that was done over Greenland. And now we have this situation where President Trump is effectively trying to blame the Europeans for the fact that we can't defeat Iran. He's implying that if only the Europeans had sent their military forces, especially their navies, to the Middle East, we would have been able to break through the Strait of Hormuz and we would have ended Iran's stranglehold on the world economy. But that didn't happen. We failed. But why did we fail? Not because of the United States, but because of the Europeans. So if you think about U.S.-European relations today, they're terrible. And what about other countries around the world, the Japanese and the South Koreans, the Indonesians, the Indians? I mean, the United States is a rogue elephant. Do you want to get too close to the Trump administration? No, you want to keep your distance. So I think in terms of our foreign policy, he has, done even greater damage than he did before February 28th. And I don't see how he digs himself out of this hole. In fact, I think if anything, his behavior will become more erratic with the passage of time. This is a man who thinks he's a genius. He thinks he has the Midas touch. He thinks anything he does works out well, and he always emerges victorious. He simply is not going to be able to make that argument in this case. This is not like all the previous cases that he got away with. And he's therefore seriously damaged goods as president of the United States, even if he manages to shut this one down reasonably quickly. And that remains to be seen, as we were talking about before. And in terms of his standing here in the United States, there's no way he's not going to take a huge hit politically. And you see him already, as you pointed out, going after people like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones. These are all people who have been big supporters of his in the past. And he's now in a major league war with them. And this is not going to help his standing. And furthermore, if you just look at what's happening inside the MAGA base, you look at what's happening with Christian evangelicals under the age of 50, I think he has truly profound political problems at home and on the foreign policy front as well.
Yeah, I was also expecting that after disasters such as this, instead of going through this process you described before, that is having some openness, where did we go wrong, air out the trouble, learning something from the mistakes, I would assume that he would seek to blame others. I guess the Europeans NATO would be a good fall guy, and also divert attention, maybe go for a quick victory, that is seize Cuba or Greenland, something like this. Such a shift focus as quick as possible, because you don't want to sit around thinking about all the things, or having too many debates in the country about all the things you did wrong. This can't do anything well for him. So I guess erratic behavior moving forward is a pretty reasonable prediction. But if we take a step back to the wider picture, what do you think the world will look like after this? Because you and I spoke in the past about the emergence of a multipolar world, that is simply the international distribution of power suggests the concentration of power we had in the 90s is now dispersed. Now you have many centers of power. The fact that, it looks as if this would intensify this development.
Well, I think that the United States has obviously lost this war, and that will become manifestly clear to more and more people. That's for sure. I don't think it will diminish American power. I think American power is based on material capabilities. And I think losing this war will not affect how much power the United States has. In making this point, I like to point to the Vietnam War. We lost the Vietnam War. It was a catastrophic defeat. It was a decisive defeat, but it didn't affect American power. We remained as powerful as ever. But this is not to deny for 1 second that losing a war in Iran will have a profound impact on our ability to project that power around the world and to influence other states in ways that are favorable to the United States. So this really matters. So again, I just want to be clear. We will remain as powerful as ever. And we do live in a multipolar world. As you know, Glenn, my argument is we've lived in a multipolar world since 2017. And the other two great powers on the planet are China and Russia. And they're not going away. And in fact, one could argue that they're better off as a result of this war vis-a-vis the United States. But it's not that China and Russia have become more powerful relative to the United States because of the war. I don't think that's what's happened. I think that America's ability to project power and to influence other countries has been seriously damaged, and that works to China's advantage and to Russia's advantage. In other words, just to take the Russian case, the Russian economy has benefited from the United States taking sanctions off of Russia in terms of selling oil. And furthermore, the Russians have benefited from the fact that there are less weapons available for us to give the Ukrainians to fight against Russia because we're using up weapons and munitions at such a rapid pace in Ukraine. In Iran. So this all works to Russia's advantage. And in terms of China, right, what's happening in East Asia is that we're pulling forces out of East Asia. We're pivoting away from East Asia because we have to move forces that are physically located in East Asia to the Middle East. This works to China's advantage. It doesn't change the balance of power, but it changes our ability to contain China in East Asia. It creates a situation where our allies in East Asia really don't trust us very much anymore. Not only are we pivoting away from East Asia, moving military forces out of the region, but also, can you trust American judgment? Do you think that the United States is a responsible ally that will take care of you in the crunch? I think if you're a Japanese leader or a South Korean leader, the answer to that question is no. You can't depend on the United States the way you once thought that you could, or the way that you once could. So again, you see the damage that we have done to ourselves. And again, to go back to our discussion of the Gulf and where we end up, we may end up losing those 13 bases, never returning to them, and having much less ability to project power in the Gulf after February 28th than we had before February 28th. So you see, our power position around the world in terms of our ability to project power, influence other countries, has been badly damaged. And again, as we were saying, you and I have said on numerous occasions, we have done enormous damage to international institutions, international law, and our treatment of allies before February 28th. So the United States is in just so much trouble.
I think what I might say is a relative decline as you have the rise of other powers. Because if Iran could have been knocked out, that would have been something that would have weakened the Russians, the Chinese, and I guess strengthened the hand of the United States. So, but measuring the ability to project power in terms of the alliance system as well is probably also a good approach, because, as you said, the Gulf states are in a very vulnerable position now. I know the rhetoric now is a bit harsh towards the Iranians, but at some point, if the U.S. presence is expected to diminish, then they're going to have to try to make some peace with the neighbors. I would say eventually the Europeans would have to do the same. We can't fight against the Russians on our own. If the Americans will reduce their presence, we're going to have to learn how to get along with the Russians. And, you can say this might be some of the calculations they're having in East Asia as well. On NATO, though, this is seems to be one of the, if not a casualty, but one of the organizations which has also been hit hard by the Iran war, simply by the mutual accusations. How do you think NATO will be affected by the way this war ended?
Well, I think this is all disastrous for NATO, or to put it in slightly different terms, for transatlantic relations. And I think the main reason is that President Trump is going to need a scapegoat for this disaster. And I think that the Europeans will probably be the number one scapegoat, because he won't blame Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the person he should blame. And he can't really blame his advisors, because none of them were enthusiastic about this. Maybe Pete Hegseth was. Maybe they'll get rid of Pete Hegseth. But I think what he's going to do is he's going to blame the Europeans. And he's going to make the argument that if the Europeans had anteed up, if they had come to our rescue, we would have won the war. The reason we lost was because our allies failed us. And given that situation, what we should do is basically stop supporting them. Will he end the alliance? Just put an end to it? I don't think so. He might. But I think that he will so seriously damage the alliance that in the end, it'll be largely meaningless. The other thing is, Glenn, he has 2 years and 2 years and 9 months left in his presidency, almost 3 years left. You know how much damage he's done in the first, let's say 15 months. Can you imagine how much damage he's going to do in the remaining 2 years and 9 months? It's going to be enormous, right? And in the meantime, the Europeans have to come up with some sort of defensive strategy for dealing with the Russians. You and I think their assessment of the Russian threat is completely overblown. But the fact is, the European elites do believe there's a serious Russian threat there. Let's take that as a given. And they also recognize that they can't rely on the United States anymore. The transatlantic partnership no longer exists. Call this a partnership? It's no longer there. So the Europeans, over the next 2 years and 9 months, have to figure out how to deal with this situation. And that's going to push them to put NATO in the background. and not take NATO seriously. So I find it hard to believe that NATO will be a meaningful alliance in January of 2029 when President Trump steps down. Now, one could argue he may step down before then. He could be impeached. He could have medical problems, and J.D. Vance could become president. And who knows what Vance would do. I tend to believe that Vance would have a more positive attitude towards NATO than Trump would. But how much more positive is hard to say. We all remember his Valentine's Day speech in Munich in February of 2025. I mean, Vance didn't look like he was friendly toward Europe then. And if he became president, maybe he wouldn't be once he was in the White House. Who knows for sure? But the future of NATO looks grim, to put it mildly.
Yeah. No, it seems to be heading towards an end. But by extension, what will all of this mean? That is the loss in the Iran war, as well as all the weapons and money that was spent, the further economic problems for the Europeans. What does this mean for the Ukraine war? Because I see Zelensky has been taking to Twitter and now that the Iran war is over, encouraging everyone to shift focus back to Ukraine. But it's going to be hard to see the appetite for Trump to deepen involvement there. Or how do you think? Well, if you take into account all of these different variables, what would you expect? How would you expect the Ukraine war to be affected by the loss of the Iran war, but also the fragmentation now we see of NATO?
I think, first of all, I wish that Zelensky were correct and the Iran war was over and we could now focus on Ukraine. I think we're going to be focusing on Iran for the foreseeable future. I mean, this is a catastrophic situation. And with regard to Ukraine, let's assume that I'm wrong and that 2 weeks from now, the war is effectively over. I don't think that's going to happen, but let's assume that happens. Okay, and let's assume that we focus on Ukraine. What does that mean? Are we going to give Ukraine a whole bevy of weapons that are going to allow Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield or do well on the battlefield? I think the answer is no. I don't think they're going to get those weapons. We have run down the inventory to the point where the last thing we want to do is give precious weapons and precious military assets to the Ukrainians. It's just not going to happen. And with regard to the Russians, we need Russian oil in global oil markets. We just need it, right, to head off economic catastrophe. And so the Russians are going to continue to do well economically, at least in the short term. And I'm sure the Russians are getting ready to launch a major set of offensives against the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, as you and I have talked about many times, are in desperate straits. And we're not in any position to rescue the Ukrainians. And this is a perfect situation for President Trump to say the Europeans are responsible. As you know, he's been pushing in that direction for a long time. So let the Europeans deal with the Ukraine situation. Because you want to understand that if people like you and I are right, Glenn, and it's only a matter of time before the Ukrainians collapse on the battlefield and the Russians push them out of Donbass and the Russians conquer even more territory on the Eastern Front, President Trump is going to want to avoid being blamed for that. And he's going to want to blame the Europeans for Ukraine's defeat. So I'm sure he, in his head, is positioning himself to create a situation where if the Ukrainians lose to the Russians and the Russians win a victory in that war, that he can say it's the Europeans' fault. We were in the fight for a long time, and as long as we were in the fight, The Ukrainians did quite well, but we could not go on forever because we had other responsibilities around the world. And by the way, in terms of those other responsibilities in places like the Middle East, the Europeans would not help us. So we were in a position where we had to turn the responsibility for dealing with Ukraine over to the Europeans, and they failed. They are responsible for this defeat. So what he'll do moving forward is he'll blame the Europeans for what's happening in Ukraine, while at the same time not giving the Europeans the necessary weaponry to give to the Ukrainians to hold their own on the battlefield. And furthermore, he'll blame the Europeans for the defeat in Iran. I mean, this is the way President Trump operates. He's not somebody who ever accepts responsibility. So I think that is what the future looks like.
Yeah, I think in one tweet he was able to squeeze in both blaming the Europeans for Iran and also say bye-bye to Greenland or something. So he seems to be, preparing both the blame game as well as a distraction, it seems. But no, there's, well, you can see what's going to happen, I think, in Ukraine. It's a bit strange the Europeans aren't preparing themselves. They're not sending more weapons, but preparing themselves in terms of picking up the phone. That would be a good first move before this whole thing begins to unravel. But I spoke recently with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, and he was making the point that he feels not just the United States, but Europe is growing increasingly irrational. And after that, I thought about asking you, actually, because do we have a good theory in international relations about, I guess, rationality in declining hegemons or collective hegemons, both the United States and Europe? Because it seems over the past years now that we're in, well, at least relative decline, as there's problems in society. The assumption we built up a society about, ideological superiority. How would we? Do you expect society and our leaders to embrace, reason fully with military defeat, such as we suffered in Iran, or economic decline, social havoc? I mean, how do you? I know in political realism we assume that the state is rational, but at least for the neoclassical realists, they would challenge this assumption. So how would you assess, or how do you expect the reason or rationality of states to function in the years to come?
Well, as you know, I wrote this book with Sebastian Rosado called How States Think, which deals directly with the question of rationality. And in fact, the opening case that we talk about is Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And our basic argument in the book is that states are rational if they pursue a policy that's based on a theory of international politics that makes good sense, that it's a plausible theory. And if you don't have a plausible theory underpinning your policy, then what you are doing is acting irrationally. And we also said that the decision-making process matters as well. You have to have a decision-making process that allows all the key players in the room to voice their opinions in a rational, legal way. So that was our definition. I think if you look at various cases, like Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I think that was clearly rational. He thought that NATO expansion was a threat to Russia. He thought it was an existential threat, and he launched a preventive war to make sure that Ukraine did not become part of NATO. So that was, in our opinion, a rational decision. One could argue that it was the wrong decision. One could argue it was an illegal decision. One could argue it was an immoral decision. But whether decision is rational or not depends on whether or not you have an underlying theory that is a proven theory and that theory underpins the policy. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the Europeans. I believe that the Europeans' behavior towards the United States, which often is labeled is irrational, is actually not irrational because it has a simple theory that underpins it, which you can argue is a legitimate theory. What am I saying here? The Europeans have a deep-seated interest in keeping the United States actively involved in Europe. The Europeans want the American pacifier to remain in place. Another way to put this is the Europeans want NATO to remain intact. And therefore, they want to do everything they can to accommodate the Americans so that the Americans don't get angry at them and the Americans remain in Europe, because it's so important from a strategic point of view for the Europeans to have the American pacifier in place. Now, you could argue that that strategy is wrong. You can have a different theory that says that it would make much more sense for the Europeans to grow a backbone, understand that their close relationship with the United States is over, that they can't depend on the American pacifier anymore, and therefore they should act differently. A good realist like me would say that's how they should behave. But that's not to say that the strategy they have employed is irrational, because there are different strategies based on different theories out there. And the question is, do you have a plausible theory? And I think that the Europeans' behavior towards the Americans is based on a plausible theory. I think it's the wrong theory, but there are lots of different theories, and those theories are all plausible. I could go into this in greater detail. I won't now. But anyway, I think a lot of what the Europeans do is not irrational. I do think it's wrong, right? But just because something is wrong does not mean it's irrational. And let me just give you one example of that. It's NATO expansion. NATO expansion was opposed by almost all realists, because all realists like me have a simple theory that says if you move NATO up to Russia's border, the Russians are going to react and you're going to have conflict. You're going to have really serious trouble. Therefore, you do not want to expand NATO. And if you do expand NATO, it's going to lead to big trouble. There was a whole set of liberal theories that underpinned our policy, not realist theories. The realist theories were rejected. The advice of realists like George Kennan and John Mearsheimer were ruled out of court. But the liberal theories said that what we want to do is we want to move NATO eastward. And what we want to do is we want to create a zone of peace in Eastern Europe. And that zone of peace will be based on a series of liberal theories. One is democratic peace theory. The idea was that if we could spread democracy eastward into Eastern Europe to include Russia at some point, we would create a giant zone of peace, because democracies don't fight other democracies. They also relied on the theory of economic interdependence. The idea was you would move the EU eastward. You would create a situation where you had a great deal of economic intercourse in Eastern Europe and maybe eventually include the Russians in that. And the end result is economic interdependence produces peace, and we would all live happily ever after. So there were a set of liberal theories. These are prominent theories that are highly respected in academia that underpin the policy. If you read the sort of the commentary of Strobe Talbot and Madeleine Albright at the time of NATO expansion, this is in the 1990s, their policy prescription for NATO expansion was based on these liberal theories. I thought it was wrong-headed, but I did not think it was irrational. That may sound funny to certain viewers, but I think there's there's a difference between whether one thinks another theory is wrong or whether you think it's irrational. So I think a lot of what is done in international politics, one can think is wrong, but it's not necessarily irrational. But I could go on, but there are lots of cases of American behavior in particular, but even European behavior in recent times that would fit under the rubric of irrational.
No, I think that's a good way of explaining it. And no, I would agree. I don't think the European policy was irrational. As you said, it was a powerful theory. And, you can link it a little bit both in political realism as well as liberalism. That is the hegemonic piece. As long as the US was all powerful, the Europeans could benefit. For one, there would be no great power rivalry, as the US, all power concentrated in the US would essentially mitigate the international anarchy. There would only be one center of power and no anarchy. Second, because it was the United States, we assumed that a liberal democracy, human rights would be elevated, so we would have this democratic peace as well. And also you can put a third leg on it, which would be that the US would be the pacifier in Europe, which would allow Europe to function as it had, because we've never been stood together since after World War II when the Americans came. So you can argue that given that they can explain what they were doing, it is rational, and I think that's also why they were willing to make an enemy of Russia by expanding NATO, because this made sure that America's presence was cemented. But my view, though, is that it could have been a good strategy, but it became the only strategy, which meant there's no political imagination for anything else. So now that the actual political realities of it, that is that the unipolar order, that is, it's not just a policy, it's an actual distribution of power, is gone. And we see that for this reason, it's in America's interest to shift its policies, that is, focus less on Europe. Now it starts to feel irrational, because now we're just returning to hope and expecting the US to stay in Europe out of just some alliance of democracies, even though it doesn't serve necessarily its interests. So it is very strange to see. Let me just ask, sorry, yeah.
Can I just make two more points about this whole subject of irrationality? Because this is a very important subject. People surely who are watching this show will want to know whether it was rational for President Trump to invade or to attack Iran on February 28th. And I believe it was irrational. And why do I think that? The basic theory that underpinned the decision to attack Iran on February 28th was that we could use air power alone to topple the regime and put in place a regime that would basically dance to America's tune, would throw up its hands, surrender to us, and do what we wanted. Okay? We know from the literature on international politics, which is well understood by many people in the policy world, that it is virtually impossible to create regime change with air power alone. There is no theory of victory that can be considered rational that is based on the idea that you can use air power alone to produce regime change. In fact, the literature says that's impossible. So what President Trump did in deciding to go to war on February 28th was not only a foolish policy, it was irrational, because he had no plausible theory of victory. Just very important to understand that. Let me give you another case. The decision that the United States made before the war started in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. What's really remarkable in the run-up to the war is, despite the fact the West, the United States in particular, thought that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, we did nothing, virtually nothing, to stop it. Then the war started. negotiations started in Istanbul, and both sides were making very good progress. And the United States told the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations. Then later, I think it was in November of that year, General Milley said that Ukraine had reached the high water mark. You remember the Ukrainian army had done quite well in two big offensives during 2022. General Milley, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, said, Ukraine has reached the high water mark. Let's cut a deal now. He was told to close his mouth and not raise the issue again. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, why was that the case? Why was the United States not attempting to prevent war? And then why did it tell the Ukrainians to walk away and tell General Milley to keep his mouth closed? The answer is actually quite simple. We thought that we could bring the Russians to their knees with economic sanctions. We had a theory of victory that was based in part on the Ukrainians holding the Russians off on the battlefield, number one. But number two, we believed that we could use crushing sanctions to cripple the Russian economy and literally knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. That was our theory of victory. I thought at the time that it was wrong. I thought that it wouldn't work. But I think it was a plausible theory of victory. I think at the time, most people I know thought that it would work. They thought that we had so much economic leverage. They thought all of this globalization of the 1990s and the early 2000s had created a situation where the United States sat at the center of this economic web that allowed it to use its coercive leverage over countries all around the planet. The way we've done with Iran, the way we've done with Venezuela, the way we tried to do with China. And that's what we thought would work with the Russians. And I think it was a plausible theory of victory. I did not think it would work. I had a different view, a different set of theories. But the point is, it was not irrational. It was wrong, but it was not irrational. But again, to go back to Trump invading Iran, that was irrational because there was no plausible theory of victory there.
My view on the Ukraine war, though, was initially I thought it made a lot of sense. That is, if you spend all these years investing all this money in training to build a massive Ukrainian army of hundreds of thousands of men, why would the US and NATO accept it to go neutral when you can use that big army to fight and weaken Russia as a strategic rival? So again, I think it's brutal, and I wouldn't advise it, but it made sense, rational. But my view is that after you mentioned November 2022, when General Milley said, well, it doesn't get better than this is when we strike a deal, it feels like at that point we were a bit swept away already by our own propaganda. That is, that the Russians were inherently weak. They could be defeated. Their economy, their gas station masquerading as a country. And at this point, it looks like all the rhetoric we had to fuel the war, suddenly we began to buy into it. And here I started to wonder, how rational is this? Because if someone came along and said, well, actually, we have to assess what the Russians actually have, then immediately, no, well, that's pro-Russian. You can, so suddenly our ability to assess the information available to make reasonable predictions, it seemed like it was all gone. And you see that today as well. Everyone more or less understands that the war can't be won, but they still want to fight it. I mean, for me now, there's no reasonable strategy anymore. There's no reasonable theory of victory anymore. So it feels as if, yes, it began rational, a bit brutal. Using Ukrainians to fight their rival, but now I feel like we drifted far away. But again, just my view.
Well, just leaving aside the issue of rationality, where I think I've said enough, let me make another point. I think, Glenn, when countries get into major wars, it's very difficult for them to get out. I've said over the years, and I think it's because, for me, the Vietnam War was a formative experience. But my rhetoric is it's easy to get in. It's incredibly difficult to get out. I like to say it's like turning a giant super tanker around in the water. You don't do it quickly. I think Iran may actually be something of an exception because of our whole discussion about the economic consequences. You know, if you take what I was saying before, and I know you agree with me on this, that the potential economic consequences here are catastrophic, right? The incentive structure may be such that we do shut this war down quite quickly, right? And it would be, I think, quite unusual in that regard. I mean, think about the Afghanistan war, 20 years. Vietnam, oh, that went on for, year after year. It was very hard to get out of that war. And this is what happens when a great power like the United States or major powers like the Europeans get involved in a war. It's just very difficult to walk away. It's the whole sunk costs argument. And I think that is what has really paralyzed the Europeans, and made it very difficult for them, to get out. The other thing is, and you were talking about this in the context of Benjamin Netanyahu before, that after a while you begin to believe your own arguments about Iran. If you say Iran is the boogeyman for 40 years, at some point along the road, even if you didn't believe it in the beginning, you certainly believe it after 40 years. And I think in terms of the Europeans, before the war in Ukraine started, I don't think the Europeans thought the Russians were a great threat. You want to remember, in 2008, at the famous Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit in April of 2008, the Europeans, in the person of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, argued against bringing Ukraine into NATO. Merkel was adamantly opposed, as was Sarkozy. It's not like the Europeans thought there was this great Russian threat out there that had to be deterred. In fact, they thought, like you and I, Glenn, that if you expanded NATO to bring Ukraine into it, Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. That's what Merkel has said, right? That's why she was opposed. We agree with her. But anyway, the United States foolishly pushed ahead, and we ended up in this disastrous war. But I think what's happened over time is that the Europeans have convinced themselves now that the Russians are the second coming of Nazi Germany, that Putin is Adolf Hitler, that the Russian army is the Wehrmacht, and oh my God, if they don't do something, they're going to have the Russian army on the beaches of Dunkirk. I mean, I find it all hard to believe. I know you do as well, but they do believe that. But it's very interesting if you think about the change that has taken place over time in European thinking about the Russian threat. And by the way, just to elevate up another 10,000 feet, if you go back to NATO expansion and the decision to bring Ukraine in April 2008, it is very important to understand that we were not interested in bringing Ukraine into NATO because we thought there was a Russian threat to Ukraine or a Russian threat to Eastern Europe. That's the realist view. The United States, which was driving the train on NATO expansion, was not operating according to realist theories. Otherwise, they would not have expanded NATO into Ukraine. They were operating on liberal theories. You want to remember that Putin was at Bucharest. They invited Putin to Bucharest. The Russians and the United States and the Russians and the Europeans actually had quite good relations at the time. We didn't see Ukraine as this great threat. Now, Ukraine is seen as a really powerful, Russia's now seen as a really powerful threat. Sorry, not Ukraine. Russia's now seen as a very powerful threat. It's really quite remarkable, the change that has taken place over time. But I bring all this up because it just shows you how difficult it is now, right, for the Europeans to change their view and put an end to this war, which, as you and I, Glenn, agree would be in the interest of every European state.
Yeah. No, this was the warning of Walter Lippmann, that when you go into war, you have all this incentive to build up your adversary as just the embodiment of evil, and then when it's time to make a peace, you can't make a peace anymore because you just convinced everyone that you're fighting evil, and that's essentially, I think where we are today. Anyways, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just one final point. You want to remember that in the Iran war a few weeks ago, President Trump